In 1907, a photographer named August stood in the doorway of room 407 holding a glass plate camera. The room before him was small, ordinary, and completely vacant. He positioned his equipment, made his exposure, and recorded the space in his logbook with a single, careful word: empty. But when the plate was developed in the darkroom hours later, something appeared in the image that should not have been there. Something that would force August to make a choice between his duty to document truth and his need to protect a secret that defied all rational explanation. What did August see in that photograph that made him label it with such a loaded, ambiguous title? And why would he order the destruction of the original negative? The photograph came from the Institute of Temporal Studies, a sprawling research complex dedicated to documenting structural changes in urban architecture following the Great Urban Shift of 1905. August served as the facility's chief photographer, a position that demanded precision, clinical detachment, and an unwavering commitment to accurate documentation. His job was simple: photograph rooms, corridors, and building facades as they existed, creating an extensive visual record for future generations of researchers and city planners. There was nothing in his job description about capturing the impossible. The Institute itself was a monument to bureaucratic order. Every photograph taken required a logbook entry. Every plate required proper labeling. Every image needed approval from the Institute director, a man named Gael, who valued protocol above all else. August had worked at the Institute for 3 years without incident, producing thousands of flawless architectural studies. Room 407 should have been just another entry in his endless catalog of institutional spaces. The room was located in the Northern Annex, a section of the Institute rarely visited by anyone except maintenance staff. It measured roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, with bare plaster walls, a concrete floor, and a single window facing an interior courtyard. The only notable feature was an antique wooden mirror mounted on the western wall. The mirror had been installed decades earlier, long before the Institute took over the building, and served a practical purpose. Maintenance workers used it to check their uniforms and equipment before entering public corridors. Nothing about the space suggested it would become the center of a mystery that would perplex investigators for more than a century. August's official log entry for that day was unremarkable. Room 407, Northern Annex, Structural Integrity Inspection, Standard Exposure, no complications. He packed his equipment, delivered the plate to the processing laboratory, and moved on to his next assignment. The photograph should have been developed, printed, filed, and forgotten. But something happened in that dark room that broke the chain of routine. The technician responsible for developing August's plates was a methodical man named Robert. Robert had processed thousands of photographic negatives during his tenure at the Institute, and he approached each one with the same careful attention to technical detail. But when he began developing the plate from room 407, he noticed something unusual. The image showed the empty room exactly as expected: bare walls, concrete floor, the antique mirror reflecting the opposite wall. But there was a distortion in the mirror's reflection, a kind of optical aberration that Robert had never encountered before. He noted it in the processing log as a distortion of light, and continued his work. When the contact print was complete, Robert brought it to August for approval. This was standard procedure. The photographer always reviewed prints before they entered the archive. But August's reaction was anything but standard. He stared at the print for a long time without speaking. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. Robert noticed sweat forming on August's forehead despite the cool temperature of the processing room. Then he gave Robert an instruction that violated every protocol the Institute had established. Destroy the negative immediately after making this single print. Do not make additional copies. Do not show this image to anyone, and label it with a single word: empty. Robert hesitated. The instruction contradicted his training and the Institute's fundamental mission of comprehensive documentation. But August was his superior. and the intensity in the photographer's eyes suggested this was not a request open for discussion. Robert followed the order. The negative was destroyed. The single surviving print received its cryptic label and disappeared into the Institute's vast archive. And August returned to his work as if nothing unusual had happened. For decades, the photograph sat forgotten in a storage room, just another routine documentation of an unremarkable space. Until a researcher named Jose discovered it in 1973. Jose was conducting a comprehensive survey of early 20th century institutional photography for his doctoral dissertation. He had spent months in the Institute's archive, examining thousands of images, most of them exactly as dull as they sounded, room after room, corridor after corridor, facade after facade. The work was tedious but necessary for his research on the evolution of documentary photography techniques. But the photograph labeled empty caught his attention for a simple reason. Why would anyone bother photographing and labeling an empty room? The label itself seemed redundant. If the room was empty, why document it at all? And if it was worth documenting, why use such a vague, almost philosophical title? José's first theory was straightforward. Perhaps empty referred to the room's status. Maybe it had recently been vacated or was scheduled for renovation. It was a clerical notation, nothing more. But when José examined the print more carefully under magnification, he noticed something that August and Robert had both seen in 1907. A faint shape in the mirror's reflection. At first glance, it appeared to be a smudge or a processing error. But when José adjusted the angle of his examination light, the shape resolved into something recognizable. It looked like a person. The room was supposed to be empty. August's log confirmed it. The official documentation confirmed it. But the mirror's reflection suggested otherwise. Someone or something had been standing in that room when August made his exposure, and that someone appeared in the reflection but nowhere else in the frame. José felt his pulse quicken. In all his months of archival research, he had never encountered anything remotely this unusual. José brought his finding to a colleague at the National Digital Archive, a specialist in historical photography analysis named Eli. Eli had access to equipment that José could only dream of: high-resolution scanners, spectral analysis tools, and digital enhancement software that could extract details invisible to the naked eye. When Eli scanned the photograph at maximum resolution, the faint shape in the mirror became clearer. It was definitely a human figure, standing approximately 6 feet from the mirror's surface. But the clothing was wrong. In 1907, Institute staff wore heavy wool uniforms with starched collars and formal jackets. Maintenance workers wore canvas coveralls. But the figure in the reflection wore something entirely different. Light, form-fitting attire that looked more like athletic wear than early 20th century work clothes. The garment appeared smooth and seamless, without visible buttons, seams, or traditional fastenings. It was clothing that would not look out of place in a modern gymnasium, but which should not exist in a photograph from 1907. The anachronism was striking and impossible to explain through conventional means. Eli ran additional tests on the reflection. The distortion that Robert had noted in his processing log was not a smudge or chemical artifact. It was a genuine photographic phenomenon, a kind of energetic halo around the reflected figure. The distortion suggested movement or some form of electromagnetic activity. It was as if the figure was not quite solid, not quite stable, not quite present in the same way the room's physical objects were present. The wall behind the figure showed normal photographic clarity. The floor showed normal shadow patterns, but the figure itself existed in a state of visual uncertainty, simultaneously present and absent. Then José made his second discovery. While searching for additional documentation about room 407, he found a forgotten journal in August's personal papers donated to the Institute archive after the photographer's death in 1954. The journal contained daily notes about technical challenges, equipment problems, and routine observations. Most entries were mundane, but the entry for the day he photographed room 407 was different. In small, cramped handwriting, August had written, "It was not empty. It was not of here." The statement was brief, cryptic, and completely at odds with his official log entry. August had seen something in that room, something he chose not to report to his supervisor, Gael. The label "empty" was not a description. It was a code. It was a way of marking the photograph as significant while concealing its true content from casual observers. Jose realized he was looking at evidence of a deliberate cover-up, a conscious decision by August to hide the truth while simultaneously preserving it for future discovery. But why? Why would August, a man who had built his career on accurate documentation, deliberately obscure the truth? Jose and Eli found their answer in Institute correspondence from 1907. A letter from Gael to the Institute's board of directors mentioned irregularities in the northern annex and the need for discreet observation. Another letter, written by a building supervisor named Jeremiah, referenced unexplained phenomena in several rooms, including room 407. The Institute was aware that something unusual was happening in that section of the building, and they wanted it documented without public disclosure. August was caught between two impossible demands: document what you see, but do not let anyone know what you have seen. The photograph was his compromise. He captured the evidence, preserved it in the archive, and labeled it in a way that would both hide and reveal its significance. Anyone looking for proof of the unusual would find it. But anyone conducting a routine survey of empty rooms would see nothing worth investigating. It was an act of subtle rebellion against institutional authority that demanded both transparency and secrecy. As Jose and Eli continued their research, they discovered additional details that deepened the mystery. A maintenance log from 1907, signed by a worker named Arthur, recorded unusual temperature fluctuations in room 407. The room would suddenly become cold, dropping as much as 15 degrees in a matter of minutes, then return to normal temperature just as quickly. A work order signed by the Northern Annex Facilities Manager requested replacement of the antique mirror, with a note stating it produces disturbing optical effects. The mirror was never replaced, and room 407 was quietly removed from regular maintenance schedules, becoming one of dozens of forgotten spaces in the Institute's sprawling complex. The figure in the reflection remained the central mystery. Jose and Eli spent months analyzing every detail of the image. They noticed something they had initially missed. The figure was holding an object in their right hand. It was small, roughly the size of a deck of cards, and appeared to be non-metallic. The surface was smooth, possibly glass or polished ceramic, and it was glowing. The glow was faint but unmistakable, a kind of internal luminescence that had nothing to do with ambient room light. The glow cast a subtle illumination on the figure's hand and lower arm, creating shadows that confirmed the object was three-dimensional and physically present. Eli ran spectral analysis on the glow. The light signature was distinct, isolated, and physically impossible according to the photographic technology of 1907. There were no artificial light sources in room 407. The room's single window faced an interior courtyard and would have provided only diffused natural light. Yet the device in the figure's hand was emitting its own illumination. The reflection was not a ghost image, not a double exposure, not a processing error. It was a physical entity captured by August's camera, something present in that room on that specific day in 1907. The spectral analysis suggested the light source operated at a wavelength inconsistent with any commercially available technology from that era. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Miles, a retired archivist who had worked at the Institute in the 1960s, contacted Jose after reading about his research in an academic journal. Miles remembered a conversation he had overheard between two senior researchers, men named Adam and Atlas, who had been discussing classified projects from the Institute's early years. One of them mentioned room 407 and referred to it as the observation point. The northern annex, according to this conversation, had not been chosen for structural documentation by accident. It had been selected because of anomalies that predated the Institute's occupation of the building. This revelation transformed Jose and Eli's understanding of the entire situation. The Institute of Temporal Studies had not simply stumbled upon something unusual in room 407. They had been actively investigating it. The Great Urban Shift of 1905, the event that justified the Institute's formation and mission, might have been more than just architectural documentation. It might have been a cover story for researching phenomena that conventional science could not explain. Jose and Eli compiled their findings into a comprehensive report. Their conclusion was both simple and shocking. The photograph labeled "empty" was not documentation of a vacant room. It was evidence of a temporal event, a moment when something or someone from another time became visible through the specific optical properties of an antique mirror. August had captured it by accident while performing routine architectural photography, and he had protected that evidence by hiding it in plain sight, using a label so obvious and so meaningless that it would preserve the photograph without raising questions from his superiors. But why did the reflection appear only in the mirror? Jose and Eli developed a theory based on historical accounts of the building that would eventually house the Institute. Before 1905, the structure had served multiple purposes, including a brief period as a private laboratory operated by a reclusive inventor named Xavier. Xavier had conducted experiments with electromagnetic fields and optical phenomena, work that his contemporaries dismissed as pseudo-scientific nonsense. Local newspapers from the 1890s contained brief mentions of Xavier's work, usually in mocking tones. One article described him as a man obsessed with capturing light that does not exist and seeing through the fabric of time itself. The antique mirror had been part of Xavier's equipment, specifically treated with metallic compounds that were supposed to enhance reflective properties. Xavier's notebooks, discovered in a separate archive by a researcher named Easton, described a process for coating mirror surfaces with silver, mercury, and trace amounts of rare earth elements. The exact formula remained unclear, as Xavier used coded notation for critical measurements, but the intent was explicit. He wanted to create a surface capable of reflecting light from multiple temporal states simultaneously. Whether Xavier succeeded in creating anything more than an interesting piece of decorative glass remained unclear. But the mirror's unique construction might have made it sensitive to distortions in time or space that ordinary surfaces could not detect. The figure in the reflection remained unidentified. Their clothing suggested they came from a period later than 1907, possibly from the mid to late 20th century or beyond. The glowing device they held defied identification entirely. Some researchers suggested it might be an early form of electronic equipment. Others proposed more exotic possibilities: a communication device from a future timeline, a temporal navigation tool, or even a recording device documenting room 407 from the opposite direction in time. But without additional evidence, any conclusion remained pure speculation. What was certain was August's role in preserving the mystery. He could have destroyed the print along with the negative. He could have reported the anomaly to Gael and allowed the Institute to conduct a proper investigation. Instead, he chose a middle path: documentation without disclosure. The label "empty" was his gift to future generations, a cryptic signal that this ordinary-looking photograph contained something extraordinary. It was an act that required both courage and cunning, preserving truth while protecting himself from the consequences of revealing it. In some ways, August's decision was an act of defiance against an institution that demanded both absolute transparency and absolute control. The Institute wanted to know everything but share nothing. August understood that some truths were too strange, too threatening to institutional authority, to be recorded openly. His label was simultaneously honest and deceptive. The room appeared empty in the photograph, but the reflection told a different story, and that contradiction was precisely what August wanted to preserve. He trusted that eventually someone would look closely enough to see beyond the obvious. A colleague of José's, a historian named Jordan, discovered additional context that made August's decision even more poignant. In 1908, 1 year after photographing room 407, August had been reassigned to field documentation work outside the Institute. The reassignment was officially described as a promotion, but August's salary remained unchanged and his responsibilities decreased significantly. It appeared to be a quiet punishment, removing him from sensitive internal projects while maintaining the appearance of normal career progression. August never again worked in the Northern Annex. He never again documented rooms that might contain unexplained phenomena, and he never spoke publicly about what he had seen in room 407. The photograph now resides in the National Digital Archive, where researchers like José, Eli, and their successors continue to study it. New scanning technologies have revealed additional details in the reflection. Texture in the figure's clothing, shadows that suggest three-dimensional form, even hints of a second object partially visible at the edge of the mirror's frame. Each new detail raises new questions. Each answer leads to deeper mysteries. The most recent analysis, conducted using quantum imaging techniques, suggested the reflected figure might be composed of matter in a state of temporal flux, simultaneously existing in multiple time states but visible only through Xavier's specially treated mirror surface. Room 407 itself no longer exists. The Northern Annex was demolished in 1982 as part of a campus renovation. The antique mirror was presumably destroyed along with the building, though some researchers claim it was removed and placed in secure storage by parties unknown. If the mirror survived, its current location remains classified or lost to institutional memory. But the photograph survives, a single frozen moment when something impossible became briefly visible. It remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that history is not as complete, not as understood, as we assume. Somewhere in the gaps between official records and forgotten journals, between routine documentation and bureaucratic cover-ups, truth waits to be discovered by those willing to look beyond the obvious. August died in 1954 without ever publicly discussing the photograph. His personal journal, discovered decades after his death, provided the only hint that he understood the significance of what he had captured. It was not empty. It was not of here. 8 words that acknowledged a reality beyond official explanation. 8 words that gave permission to future researchers to look closer, to question more deeply, to trust that even the most ordinary-seeming photograph might contain evidence of the extraordinary. Those 8 words became the foundation for an entire field of research into temporal anomalies and photographic evidence of unexplained phenomena. What do you think that figure was doing in room 407? Was it an accidental visitor from another time? Briefly visible through the unique properties of Xavier's mirror? Or was it something else entirely, something we still lack the framework to understand? The photograph raises these questions but provides no final answers. And perhaps that ambiguity is exactly what makes it so compelling. History is not a collection of solved mysteries. It is a landscape of clues, fragments, and unanswered questions waiting for the next August, the next José, the next curious mind willing to look at an image labeled empty and wonder what else might be hidden in the reflection. The legacy of the photograph extends beyond academic research. It has inspired countless investigations into other historical images that might contain similar anomalies. Researchers have begun systematically examining archival photographs from the early 20th century, looking for other examples of unexplained reflections, temporal distortions, or figures wearing anachronistic clothing. Some have found promising candidates. Others have found nothing but dust, scratches, and the normal imperfections of century-old photographic materials. But the search continues, driven by the knowledge that August's photograph proves such evidence can exist, can survive, and can wait patiently for someone willing to see what others overlooked.